Sometimes, the moments that most define our lives happen when no one is watching. It was one of those nights when silence weighed more than 1,000 words, and in Canon Curry's room, just 10 years old, something was about to change forever. The muffled sound of sobs echoed through the walls of the room decorated with basketball posters. Have you ever wondered what it's like to grow up as the son of a legend? Canon would discover that night that great pressures create great fractures, and, sometimes, it's those fractures that finally allow us to breathe. It was impossible not to feel the tension that hung in the air of the Curry house that Monday in March. The smell of dinner still lingered in the kitchen, mixed with the familiar aroma of sunscreen that always stuck to clothes after practice. But this time, there was something different. An atmosphere charged with unfulfilled expectations, unspoken words, an invisible weight that grew with each passing day. Canon was sitting on the edge of his bed, still wearing his sweaty youth team uniform. His small hands trembled as he untied his basketball shoes, the same shoes Steph had personally chosen, with that proud smile that could light up any room. "These will take you far, son," he had said in the store. But that night, those shoes seemed to weigh a ton. What's most striking is how a 10-year-old child can carry the world on his shoulders without anyone noticing. Canon wiped his face with the back of his hand, trying to erase the traces of tears that stubbornly continued to fall. Downstairs, he could hear the familiar sound of the television, probably Steph watching NBA highlights, as he always did before bed. Naturally, this leads us to wonder, how many times in life do we pretend to be okay when we're falling apart inside? The game had ended 3 hours ago. Youth Warriors against Youth Lakers, a match that should have been just fun among children, but had transformed into something much heavier. Canon had missed 7 out of 10 three-point attempts. 7. Each miss echoed on the court like a painful echo of the expectations everyone placed on him. "He's Curry's son!" someone shouted from the stands, when Canon missed his 4th consecutive shot. "Must take after his mother," laughed another. The words cut deeper than any technical criticism could have cut. The coach had been kind, as always. "Don't worry, Canon. Your father also missed shots when he was your age." But even this kindness sounded like an inevitable comparison, a constant reminder of who he should be. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps in the hallway made Canon straighten his posture. It was Steph, climbing the stairs with that familiar cadence, 2 steps at a time, always hurried, always with purpose. Canon knew every sound in that house, every movement of his father, as if they were notes from a song that had been playing for 10 years. "Canon? Can I come in?" The loving voice crossed through the wooden door. Something that touches deeply is how a simple question can carry so much love and concern. Canon took a deep breath, trying to control his voice that still trembled. "Sure, Dad." Steph entered the room with that smile that had won millions of fans around the world. But this time, there was something different in his eyes, a subtle concern that only a father could detect. He sat in the chair beside the bed, creating that safe space that had always existed between them. "Hey there, champ. How was today's game?" The question hung in the air like a cloud heavy with rain. Canon knew Steph already knew the result. Coaches always called, other parents always commented, the youth basketball community was too small for secrets. It was normal, Dad." The lie came out with the naturalness of someone who had already practiced this answer many times. Steph leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. It was impossible not to notice that he was using that body language he always used when he wanted to have a serious conversation. The silence stretched for a few seconds. Not an uncomfortable silence, but a silence full of possibilities. "Canon," Steph began, and his voice carried that wisdom that comes from someone who had already faced unimaginable pressures. "You know you can tell me anything, right? We're a team, you and I. How is it possible that such simple words have the power to open emotional floodgates that had been closed for so long?" Cannon felt his chest tighten. It was as if all the repressed emotions of recent months were fighting to come out at the same time. But there was still a barrier, an invisible wall built brick by brick, game after game, comparison after comparison. "Dad, I don't want to play basketball anymore." The words came out as a whisper, but echoed in the room like a scream. Steph blinked a few times, processing what he had just heard. It was as if the world had stopped for an instant. The ceiling fan continued spinning. The clock on the wall continued marking time. But something fundamental had changed in that space. "Don't want to play anymore?" Steph repeated, his voice maintaining the same loving tone without judgment. "Can you explain why?" Cannon shook his head, biting his lower lip, a habit he had developed when he got nervous. The cold feeling in his stomach intensified, as if he were about to jump off a cliff without knowing if there would be water below. I just don't want to anymore. That's it." But Steph Curry hadn't become one of the greatest players in history by accepting superficial answers. He knew that behind every quit, there's a deeper story, a pain that needs to be heard and understood. "Okay," Steph said, surprising Cannon with the simplicity of the response. "You don't have to play if you don't want to, but can I ask you a question?" Cannon nodded, still looking at his own feet. "Are you afraid of something?" The question fell like a silent bomb. Cannon felt his heart race. His hands become sweaty. It was exactly the question he most feared answering, but at the same time, the question that most needed to be asked. Naturally, this leads us to realize that the deepest fears are those we guard as our most precious secrets. Cannon looked at his father, that man who seemed to never be afraid of anything, who faced packed arenas with the same tranquility with which he drank his morning coffee, who transformed pressure into diamonds. Cannon began, but his voice failed. A solitary tear rolled down his face, followed by another and another. Steph got up from the chair and sat on the bed, beside his son. Without saying a word, he put his arm around Cannon's small shoulders, creating that embrace that always fixed everything. Or at least, had always fixed everything, until now. "It's okay to be afraid," Steph whispered. "Even superheroes are afraid sometimes." Have you ever wondered what's most striking when we see vulnerability in those we admire? It's discovering that our own humanity is not a weakness, but a universal connection that unites us all. Cannon leaned his head on his father's shoulder, smelling the familiar scent of the cologne Steph always wore. A mixture of wood and something that smelled like victories and defeats transformed into wisdom. "Dad, I'm very scared," Cannon finally whispered, his voice choked. "But I don't know if I can tell you." Steph tightened the embrace a little more, as if he wanted to transfer some of his strength to that small heart that was beating so fast. "It doesn't have to be today," he said with the patience of someone who understands that some truths need time to mature. "When you're ready, I'll be here. I'll always be here." The fan continued spinning on the ceiling, creating a gentle breeze that swayed the curtains. Outside, the world continued its normal rhythm, cars passing by, people returning home, life happening as it always had. But there, in that room, something had changed. Canon had taken the first step of a journey that neither he nor Steph imagined how deep it would be. Great transformations always begin with small admissions of vulnerability. "Dad?" Canon murmured against Steph's shoulder. "Yes, son. Thank you for not forcing me to tell." Steph smiled. Not the television smile, not the poster smile, but the smile of a father who had just understood that sometimes the greatest gift we can give someone is time. Always, Canon. Always. As the night progressed, and the Curry house prepared for another day, neither of them knew that soon that fear guarded under 7 keys would transform into the key to one of the most important conversations of their lives. But what no one expected was that first, Canon would need to find enough courage to open a door he had locked long ago. And sometimes, finding courage is the scariest part of the entire journey. 3 days had passed since that conversation in the room, and the Curry house carried a different tension in the air. It was as if everyone knew that something important was pending, waiting for the right moment to come to light. Have you ever noticed how some truths remain hovering in the environment, invisible but palpable, until someone has enough courage to name them? Steph had respected Canon's space, but his father's eyes couldn't help but notice the small signs. The way Canon pushed food around on his plate during dinner, how he avoided looking directly when they talked about basketball, how his shoulders seemed to carry an invisible weight that grew each day. It was a typical Thursday in California. The golden afternoon sun filtered through the living room windows, creating that cozy atmosphere that always made the Curry house seem like a refuge from the outside world. The smell of freshly made popcorn mixed with the aroma of coffee that Steph always prepared in the mid-afternoon, a ritual he had inherited from his own father. Canon was sitting on the living room sofa, pretending to pay attention to his tablet, but Steph could tell that the boy's eyes weren't really focused on the screen. It was possible to feel that an emotional storm was forming behind that apparent calm. "Canon?" Steph called softly, approaching with 2 cups, one of coffee and another of hot chocolate, the way Canon had always liked since he was little. "How about we talk a bit?" The question hung in the air like a bridge being built between 2 hearts that wanted to meet but didn't know exactly how. Canon looked up from the tablet, and for the first time in days, Steph saw something different in his son's eyes. Not just fear, but maybe relief. "Dad, Canon began, but the words got lost halfway, as always happened when he approached that forbidden territory of the heart. Steph sat beside his son, maintaining a respectful distance, but offering enough proximity so Canon would know he wasn't alone. It was impressive how Steph had learned, over the years, that sometimes silent presence speaks louder than 1,000 words of encouragement. "Do you remember when you were younger and were afraid of the dark?" Steph began, his voice carrying that nostalgic tone that always appeared when he wanted to connect the present with precious memories. "You made me sit beside your bed until you could fall asleep." Canon smiled for the first time in days, a small smile, but genuine. It was impossible not to remember those nights when the world seemed less scary, with his father nearby. "And do you know what I did on those nights?" Steph continued, taking a sip of coffee. "I would sit there watching you sleep and thinking about all my own fears." This confession caught Canon by surprise. How was it possible that someone like Steph Curry, who faced crowds screaming his name, who played in the most decisive moments without hesitation, had fears? "What were you afraid of, Dad?" Naturally, this question leads us to the heart of a universal truth. All of us regardless of what we conquer or how the world sees us, carry fears that make us human. Steph put his cup on the table and turned to face Canon directly. It was one of those moments when a father decides whether he'll maintain the mask of perfection or show his son that being vulnerable is also being brave. "I was afraid of not being a good father to you," Steph said, his words cutting through the air like a sacred confession. "I was afraid that my career would occupy so much space in our lives that you would grow up without really knowing me." Canon blinked a few times, processing this revelation. The father he saw as invincible, as someone who never doubted himself, had just admitted a deep vulnerability. "But Dad, you're the best father in the world," Canon whispered, and there was so much sincerity in those words that Steph felt his chest tighten. "Thank you for saying that, son. But do you know what helped me overcome that fear?" Canon shook his head, completely absorbed in the conversation. "It was understanding that being a father isn't about being perfect. It's about being present. It's about listening. It's about creating a safe space where you can be exactly who you are." Steph paused, letting these words find their place in Canon's heart. "And it's about sharing our fears with each other. Because when we share the weight, it becomes lighter." Have you ever wondered why it's so difficult to admit our fears to those we love most? Maybe it's because we fear disappointing. Maybe because we want to protect. Or maybe because we don't understand yet that our vulnerability can be the greatest gift we offer someone. Canon felt something moving inside his chest, as if a door that had been locked for a long time was beginning to creak, preparing to open. His father's words created an atmosphere of safety he hadn't felt in months. "Dad, can I tell you something? But do you promise you won't be angry with me?" The question came loaded with so much fear and hope that Steph felt tears forming in his eyes. It was exactly the moment he had been waiting for. That delicate instant where trust decides whether it will flourish or retreat. "Canon, there's nothing in this world you could tell me that would make me angry with you. Nothing at all." The silence that followed was different from all previous silences. It was no longer a heavy silence of guarded secrets, but a silence pregnant with possibilities, a sacred space being created for a truth that was about to be born. Canon took 3 deep breaths, 1, 2, 3, as if preparing to dive into deep waters. "Dad, I'm afraid," he began, his voice trembling like a leaf in the wind. "I'm very afraid of never being good enough to be your son." The words came out like a dam that burst, releasing all the accumulated pressure. Canon began to cry, not that contained crying of recent days, but a liberating cry, as if each tear carried with it a piece of the pain he had been keeping. Something that touches deeply is discovering that the simplest words can carry the most complex fears. Steph felt the world stop for a moment. All the victories, all the trophies, all the achievements that defined his public career seemed insignificant before his son's real pain. "Canon," Steph whispered, pulling the boy into an embrace that tried to heal years of silent misunderstandings. "My son, you don't understand." But Canon hadn't finished. The floodgates had opened, and years of accumulated pressure began to pour out in broken words. "I see how people look at me at school, in basketball, on the street. They always expect me to be like you. And when I miss a shot, when I can't make that play, when I'm not as fast as you were at my age, I see disappointment in their eyes." Cannon's tears were soaking Steph's shirt, but he didn't move, creating a safe space for all that pain to finally find voice. And the worst of all, Canon continued, sobbing, is that I'm afraid that one day you'll also look at me with disappointment, that you'll realize your son isn't special like you, that I'm just normal. How many times in life do we discover that the fears that most paralyze us are those we create in our own minds? Steph held Canon's face between his hands, forcing the boy to look directly into his eyes. Canon, listen to what I'm going to tell you, and I want you to keep this in your heart for the rest of your life, Steph said, his voice loaded with such intense emotion that it seemed to vibrate in the air around them. It was impossible not to notice that this moment would become an emotional anchor for both. One of those instants that define not just a conversation, but an entire relationship. You don't need to be like me to be my son. You don't need to play basketball to be my pride. You don't need to conquer anything, prove anything, be anything other than exactly who you are in this moment. Steph paused, letting these words penetrate deeply into Canon's wounded heart. Do you know what I'm most proud of about you? It's not the points you score or don't score. It's your kindness with friends. It's how you worry when someone is sad. It's how you share your lunch at school. It's how you hug me when I come home tired. Canon gradually stopped crying, absorbing each word as if it were water after years in the desert. I became who I am in basketball because I discovered my own path, not because I tried to be like someone else, Steph continued, his voice gaining that inspiring force that had so often motivated teammates in the most difficult moments. And what I want most in life is to help you discover your own path, whatever it may be. In that moment, something fundamental changed in the living room atmosphere. It was as if years of invisible pressure had finally found an escape valve, allowing father and son to breathe freely for the first time in a long while. But what if I never discover what my path is? Canon asked, still nestled in his father's embrace. Steph smiled, that smile that didn't appear in NBA photos, but was reserved only for the most precious moments of real life. Then we'll discover it together, without rush, without pressure, without expectations beyond being kind and being happy. How is it possible that a simple change in perspective has the power to transform mountains into hills? Canon felt something settling inside his chest. Not the complete resolution of all his fears, but the beginning of a new way to understand himself and his place in the world. Dad, can I ask you a question? As many as you want. Do you think there's anything I do better than you? The question caught Steph off guard, and he laughed. Genuine laughter, full of surprise and joy. Canon, you do thousands of things better than me. You're much kinder, much more observant, much braver in admitting your fears. Brave? Canon interrupted, surprised. But I'm afraid of everything. And that's exactly why you're brave, Steph explained, with that wisdom that comes from someone who had already faced his own inner demons. Courage isn't not being afraid. Courage is being afraid and still choosing to be honest about it, choosing to ask for help, choosing to trust. Naturally, this leads us to a fundamental discovery. Sometimes, our greatest fears are also our greatest opportunities for growth and connection. As the afternoon sun began to set outside, painting the living room with golden tones of end of day, Canon felt different. Not completely healed from all his fears, that would still take time, but fundamentally changed by the experience of being heard, understood, and accepted exactly as he was. Dad, thank you for listening to me. Thank you for trusting me, Steph responded, tightening the embrace once more. But what neither of them yet imagined was that this conversation would be just the beginning of an even deeper journey. Because sometimes, when we finally find the courage to share our greatest fear, we discover it was just the tip of a much larger iceberg. And sometimes, it's those unexpected discoveries that lead us to the most beautiful transformations of our lives. There are moments in life when we discover that teaching our children is, in reality, learning from them about ourselves. Steph spent the entire night awake after that conversation, staring at the bedroom ceiling and processing every word Canon had said. How was it possible that 10 years of fatherhood hadn't prepared him to hear those devastating words? Dawn brought with it a painful clarity. While the world slept around the Curry house, Steph found himself confronted with a truth that had gone unnoticed. In his quest to be the best athlete in the world, maybe he had created a shadow so large that his own son couldn't find sunlight. It was Friday morning, and the familiar smell of coffee mixed with something different in the air, an atmosphere charged with revelations yet to come. Canon came, down for breakfast with eyes still swollen from crying so much the night before, but there was something new in his posture. It was as if an invisible weight had been removed from his shoulders. "Good morning, champ," Steph said, but his voice carried a gravity Canon had never heard before. "Good morning, Dad." Steph served a glass of orange juice for Canon and sat at the kitchen table, not at the head, as he always did, but beside his son. It was a simple gesture, but one that spoke volumes about the change that had happened between them. Have you ever wondered how a single conversation can completely alter the dynamics of a relationship? Steph would discover that morning that sometimes, when our children show us their deepest fears, they also show us our own blind spots. "Canon, I need to apologize to you for something," Steph began, his words cutting through the morning silence like an unexpected confession. Canon looked up from his cereal bowl, surprised. In 10 years of life, he had never heard his father apologize for something related to parenting. Apologize for what? Steph took a deep breath, as if preparing to reveal something he had kept not just from Canon, but from himself. "For creating a world where you felt you needed to be like me to be worthy of my love." It was impossible not to feel the weight of that admission. Steph had spent the entire night replaying moments, conversations, small gestures that, seen together, created a pattern he had never consciously perceived. "Dad, you never said I needed to be like you," Canon protested, with that innocent loyalty that only children demonstrate. "No, son, I never said that with words." Steph paused, carefully choosing each word that would follow. But sometimes, what we don't say speaks louder than everything we do say. Naturally, this leads us to a deep reflection. How many expectations do we transmit without realizing, through looks, sighs, subtle comparisons that we don't even recognize as comparisons? Steph got up from the table and walked to the kitchen window, looking at the backyard where he had played basketball with Canon so many times. Each hoop installed there, each afternoon of practice, each "let's improve that shot." All of this, which seemed like love and dedication, had transformed into silent pressure. "You know, Canon, when I was your age, my father also played professional basketball," Steph began, turning to face his son. "And I remember thinking I needed to prove I was worthy of being his son." Canon stopped eating, completely absorbed in this revelation. It was the first time Steph had shared something so personal about his own childhood. "And did it work?" Canon asked, with that genuine curiosity only children possess. Steph laughed, but it was laughter filled with melancholy. "For a while, I thought it did. Every time I played well, Every time I exceeded an expectation, I felt like I was earning the right to be loved. Steph returned to the Audi table, sitting again beside Canon. But do you know what I discovered after years of doing that? What? That my father's love was always there, regardless of what I did or didn't do. The problem was that I was so busy trying to deserve it that I never stopped to simply receive it. Something that touches deeply is realizing that sometimes we spend years chasing something that was always within our reach. Canon processed these words with that intensity only children can dedicate to important truths. Dad, do you think I'm doing the same thing? The question caught Steph off guard, not by the question itself, but by the maturity with which Canon had connected the dots. I think I put you in a position where you felt you needed to do that, Steph responded, his voice loaded with a vulnerability he rarely showed. And that breaks my heart. The silence that followed was different from all previous silences. It was a processing silence of two souls recognizing each other in a new depth. Can I tell you a secret, Canon? Canon nodded, feeling he was about to hear something that would change his perspective forever. All my best moments in basketball, all my most important achievements, none of that compares to the pride I felt yesterday when you had the courage to tell me your fear. Steph paused, letting these words find their place in Canon's heart. Because in that moment, you weren't trying to be like me. You were being exactly who you are. And who you are is extraordinary. How is it possible that simple words have the power to rebuild self-esteem that took years to be demolished? Canon felt something reorganizing inside his chest, like pieces of a puzzle finally finding their correct places. Dad, can I ask you a kind of difficult question? Always. Do you sometimes wish I were different? The question hit Steph like a punch to the stomach. It was exactly the kind of question he most feared, because he knew the honest answer would require him to confront his own unexamined prejudices and expectations. Canon, Steph began, and then stopped. He could give a diplomatic answer, an answer that would protect Canon's feelings. But after the courage his son had demonstrated the night before, he owed at least the same honesty. I'm going to be completely honest with you, okay? Canon nodded, preparing for whatever would come. Sometimes, yes. Sometimes I wished you were more competitive, more obsessed with basketball, more like me. Steph saw Canon's face contract slightly and continued quickly. But do you know what I discovered? That when I wished you were different, it wasn't because there was something wrong with you. It was because there was something wrong with the way I was looking at you. Have you ever wondered how many times we try to mold the people we love so they fit into our own vision limitations? What do you mean? I mean, I was trying to see you through my own fears, my own insecurities. When you didn't show interest in basketball the way I thought you should, I interpreted that as failure, but not yours, mine. It was impossible not to notice that this conversation was transforming into something much bigger than a conversation between father and son. It was becoming a moment of mutual healing, where old wounds finally found light and air to begin healing. Dad, are you still afraid of something today? The question came with that disconcerting simplicity only children can formulate. Steph laughed, but it was laughter of recognition and surprise. I have several fears, Canon, but do you know what the biggest one is today? Canon shook his head. My biggest fear is that you'll reach 20, 30, 40 years old and still be trying to prove something to me instead of simply being happy, being who you are. This confession fell like an emotional bomb in the kitchen. Canon felt tears forming in his eyes. Not tears of sadness, but tears of relief, as if an invisible prison was finally being opened. "Do you really mean that?" "Son, I'm going to do something I've never done before," Steph said, taking Canon's small hands between his. "I'm going to make you a solemn promise, looking into your eyes." Steph took a deep breath, as if preparing to make a sacred vow. "I promise that starting today, I will work every day to create a space where you can discover who you really are, without pressure, without comparisons, without expectations, beyond being kind and being happy." Naturally, this leads us to the understanding that the greatest gifts we can give to the people we love are not our achievements or our expectations, but our unconditional acceptance. Canon got up from the chair and ran to hug Steph with an intensity that spoke of years of repressed love finally finding free expression. "Dad, I love you so much," Canon whispered in Steph's ear. "I love you too, son, more than you can imagine." As they embraced there in the kitchen, with the morning sun creating a golden halo around them, something fundamental had changed in the Curry house atmosphere. It wasn't just the resolution of a conflict, but the birth of a new way of relating to each other. "Canon, can I tell you what my new dream is for both of us?" "Sure. My dream is that we discover together what your own dream is. Not what I think it should be, not what the world expects it to be, but what makes your heart beat faster when you think about it. How is it possible that a change in perspective has the power to transform not just a conversation, but an entire family dynamic? And what if I never discover it? Then we'll enjoy the process of searching, without rush, without pressure, just the two of us discovering the world together." Canon stepped away from the embrace and looked directly into his father's eyes, not with fear, as he had done so many times, but with renewed confidence. "Dad, can I tell you something?" "Always." "I think my dream might be starting right now." Steph felt his chest swell with emotion. It was as if years of invisible construction had finally resulted in the most beautiful structure he had ever seen. A relationship based on mutual acceptance, shared vulnerability, and unconditional love. But what neither of them yet knew was that this morning of revelations and promises would be just the beginning of an even deeper journey. Because sometimes, when we finally find the courage to be completely honest with each other, we discover that real transformation happens not just in the words we speak, but in the actions we choose from them. And sometimes, it's those actions that create the most precious moments of our lives. 3 weeks had passed since that transformative morning in the kitchen, and the Curry house breathed a completely different air. It was as if someone had opened all the windows after years of keeping them closed, allowing a fresh breeze to circulate through every corner, every conversation, every shared moment. Have you ever noticed how some changes are so profound that they transform not just what we do, but who we are? Steph would discover in those weeks that the greatest victory of his life wouldn't happen on a basketball court, but on an ordinary Saturday afternoon in his backyard. It was one of those golden California Saturdays where the sun seemed to paint everything with more vivid and warm tones. Canon was in the backyard, not playing basketball as he used to do under pressure, but experimenting with something completely different. He had discovered a passion for photographing the shadows that trees created on the ground throughout the day. Steph watched him from the kitchen window, drinking his morning coffee and feeling something he took time to identify. It was pure pride, unmixed with frustrated expectations or inevitable comparisons. His son was simply being himself. "How about we go down to talk?" Steph murmured to himself, a phrase that had become a ritual between them in recent weeks. When Canon saw his father approaching, there wasn't that familiar tension, that shoulder stiffening that always preceded conversations about performance or improvement. Instead, Canon smiled, a genuine, free smile, as if he finally had permission to be a child. "Hi, Dad. Want to see something cool I discovered?" It was impossible not to feel how this simple question carried a silent revolution. Canon wasn't trying to impress, wasn't apologizing in advance for something that might not be good enough. He was simply sharing his joy. "Sure, show me." Canon picked up the digital camera he had received for his birthday, a gift that used to be forgotten in the drawer, and began showing the photos he had taken. "Look, Dad, I discovered that if you photograph the same shadow at different times, it tells a completely different story. In the morning, it's long and mysterious. At noon, it almost disappears. And in the afternoon, it becomes golden and welcoming." Steph looked at the photos with that complete attention he reserved only for the most important things. And in that moment, nothing in the world was more important than his son's genuine discovery. "Canon, this is incredible. You have a unique eye for capturing moments." Naturally, this leads us to a profound revelation. When we stop trying to mold our children to be extensions of our own dreams, they finally have space to flourish in their own dreams. "You know what else I discovered?" Canon continued with that contagious excitement only children can demonstrate. "I discovered I like photographing people being themselves when they think no one is watching. Like that photo of you when you were reading on the sofa and smiled alone because of something in the book." Steph blinked a few times, surprised, not just by Canon's sharp observation, but by the depth with which his son had begun to see the world. "You photographed that?" "I did. And do you know why? Because in that moment, you weren't Steph Curry from the NBA. You were just my dad, being happy with something simple." How is it possible that a 10-year-old child can articulate truths that some adults take decades to understand? Steph felt something moving deeply inside his chest, an emotion that was part pride, part gratitude, part amazement at his son's unexpected wisdom. "Canon, can I ask you a question?" "Sure." "How do you feel now, compared to a few weeks ago?" Canon stopped handling the camera and looked directly at his father. It was one of those moments where a simple answer can reveal a complex transformation. "I feel light," Canon said, choosing the word carefully. "Like I can breathe deeper. And you know what's coolest?" "What?" "I stopped being afraid of disappointing you. Not because I stopped caring about what you think, but because I discovered you're proud of me, regardless of what I do." Something that touches deeply is realizing that sometimes the greatest transformation happens, not when we change who we are, but when we finally have permission to be who we always were. Steph sat on the grass beside Canon, creating that space of equality that had become the trademark of their conversations. "Canon, you're right. And you know what? You taught me something very important in these last weeks." "I taught you something?" Canon asked, surprised by the idea that a child could teach something to such a successful adult. "You taught me that being a father isn't about creating probably a smaller version of myself. It's about creating a safe space where you can discover the best version of yourself." Steph paused, looking at the trees that created those shadows Canon had learned to photograph. "And you know what I discovered about myself in the process?" Canon shook his head, completely absorbed in the conversation. I discovered that my greatest accomplishment in life isn't the trophies I have in the living room, isn't the records I broke, isn't even the games I won. Steph turned to face Canon directly. My greatest accomplishment is having a son, brave enough to be vulnerable with me, smart enough to follow his own curiosity, and kind enough to teach me to be a better father. Have you ever wondered how it's possible that an ordinary afternoon can contain more meaning than years of public achievements? Canon felt his eyes water, not with sadness or fear, but with an emotion he was still learning to name: fullness. Dad, can I tell you a secret? Always. Sometimes I still feel a little chill in my stomach when I think about basketball. But now it's different. How so? Before it was fear of not being good enough. Now it's curiosity. Like, I wonder if I can like basketball in my own way, without trying to be like you? It was impossible not to notice that this question represented a silent revolution in how Canon saw not just basketball, but any challenge in life. And what do you think? Can you? Canon smiled. That smile that had become more frequent in recent weeks, a smile free from calculations or expectations. I think I can try to find out, without pressure, without rush, just to see what happens. Steph laughed, a laugh full of genuine joy. You know what that reminds me of? What? It reminds me of when I was very little and started playing basketball not because I wanted to impress anyone, but because it was fun, before there was any pressure, any expectations, any comparisons. Naturally, this leads us to a fundamental discovery. Sometimes the path back home is also the path forward, to a new version of ourselves. Dad, do you want to play a little with me? But not a practice session. Just fun? The question caught Steph completely off guard. It had been months since Canon had shown spontaneous interest in basketball, and now there he was, making the invitation with a lightness Steph hadn't seen in so long. Sure, son, but you have to promise me something. What? If at any moment it stops, being fun, we stop. No explanations, no guilt, nothing. We just stop and do something else. Canon nodded enthusiastically, and the two walked together to the hoop in the backyard. The same hoop where so many frustrations had been born, where so many silent comparisons had hurt, where so many unspoken expectations had weighed like lead. But that afternoon, the hoop was just a hoop. Steph was just a father. Canon was just a son. And basketball was just an excuse to spend time together. Dad, let's create our own game, Canon suggested, picking up the ball with that naturalness he had lost for so long. How so? A game where we don't compete against each other. A game where we compete against, I don't know, against boredom, against sadness, against pressure. How is it possible that a child can reinvent concepts that adults take as immutable? Steph looked at Canon with that amazement we reserve for moments when we witness pure and simple genius. Explain this idea better. Look, every time one of us makes a basket, instead of scoring a point against the other, we share something good that happened during the week. And every time we miss, we share something we learned or something we're grateful for. Steph stood in silence for a few seconds, absorbing the depth of that simple proposal. His son had just transformed basketball, a traditionally competitive sport, into a tool for connection and gratitude. Canon, that's brilliant. Let's start. And so began the most important game of both their lives. Not a game to win or lose, not a game to prove something to someone, but a game to celebrate who they were, together, in that moment. Steph shot first and made it. Something good that happened this week. I discovered my son is an incredible photographer. Canon smiled and took the ball. My turn. He shot and missed, but instead of frustration, he simply followed the rules of the game he had created. Something I learned. That missing can be as cool as making it when we're not being judged. Something that touches deeply is realizing that sometimes the most beautiful transformations happen not when we change circumstances, but when we change how we relate to them. They played for almost an hour, and each shot became an opportunity for connection. Each make or miss transformed into a bridge between two hearts that had found a new way to meet. When they finally stopped, sweaty and smiling, Canon looked at Steph with that seriousness only children can demonstrate when they want to say something really important. Dad, thank you. For what, son? For letting me be myself, and for discovering who you are when you're not being everyone else's Steph Curry. Steph felt tears forming in his eyes. It was as if all the success of his career, all the achievements he had accumulated over the years, finally made sense. Not for themselves, but because they had created the conditions for that moment of perfect shared humanity. Thank you, Canon, for teaching me that the best version of myself is the one that appears when I'm being the father of the best son in the world. As the sun began to set, painting the backyard with golden tones that Canon would certainly photograph later, father and son embraced with that naturalness that only exists when there's nothing to prove, nothing to conquer beyond the present moment. Have you ever wondered how it's possible that a single conversation, a single change in perspective, can alter the course of two entire lives? That afternoon, Steph and Canon discovered that the answer wasn't in grand gestures or monumental achievements. It was in the courage to be vulnerable with each other, in the wisdom to accept their mutual imperfections, and in the daily decision to choose connection over performance. And sometimes, it's those apparently simple decisions that create the most lasting legacies of our lives. 6 months later, Canon still photographed shadows, still played basketball from time to time for fun, and still was simply himself. And Steph was still a basketball legend, but he had also become something even more important. A father who learned that the greatest gift we can give our children is not our success, but our unconditional acceptance. How is it possible that a story about fear transforms into a story about freedom? Perhaps because we discover that, on the other side of our greatest fears, isn't the destruction we imagined, but the authentic connection we were always seeking. And sometimes, that discovery changes not just a family, but everyone who witnesses that it's possible to love without conditions, grow without comparisons, and be extraordinary simply by being who we are. Naturally, this leads us to the understanding that the most important moments of our lives rarely happen under spotlights. They happen in brave conversations, sincere embraces, games invented on any given afternoon, where two people decide to be completely real with each other. And when that happens, it doesn't matter who's watching or not watching. What matters is that something sacred was born, a connection that will resist all the storms of life, fueled not by expectations or achievements, but by the most powerful fuel that exists: unconditional love.